Hello everybody, it's 8 o'clock and we're ready to start this evening's webinar. So just wanted to introduce myself properly. So I'm Frances Meek from BNF and I'm part of the education team here. And I also have my colleague Alex White with me, and he's going to be my IT backup for this evening, but also he'll be monitoring the chat box to see if you've got any questions for Barbara. So please do let us know if you would like to ask Barbara anything, and then we can pose the questions to her at the end of the webinar. Some people are still set to just all panelists on the chat box. That actually means that only we in the office and Barbara can see actually what your questions are. So if you'd like everybody else to see them, please do change that to panelists and attendees. So what I need to do now really is just to introduce Barbara. So I'm sure most of you know Barbara, have worked with her on a variety of training events that she's been involved with over the years, but you'll know that Barbara is a really experienced food teacher and very passionate about food science. So we're really lucky to have her doing this presentation for us this evening, and particularly at this time in the evening as well. And Barbara's passion and experience, I think, will really help us to have a fantastic event and presentation this evening, and you'll go away learning, having learnt a huge amount of information and some really practical ideas how you can actually put food science into action in your classrooms. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass over to Barbara once I've just talked about a little bit about some housekeeping. So we're going to be recording the webinar, and it will be uploaded shortly to the new Food Effective Life website. As I said before, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be redirected to a short online evaluation. It literally takes just a minute, and then at the end of that, you'll be taken straight to a downloadable certificate, which you can then keep in your records to show that you've attended this CPD session. So what will happen is once we close down the meeting or the webinar, you'll then be directly taken to that certificate. So I'm going to pass you over to Barbara in just a moment.
So thank you, Frances, and hello and welcome to tonight's BNF webinar from me. It's really nice to have you tuned in, and I very much appreciate you being here with me. My name's Barbara Monks, and my passion is food science. It always has been, so it's great to be able to introduce the topic for tonight, which is food science in action. The key focus and questions for coverage in tonight's discussion are: why is it important to know about the function of ingredients? And what is protein denaturation, and why and how does it happen? I will cover different ways to demonstrate and show denaturation within classroom-based practical activities, and show some ideas for food science investigations. I will also show where recipes and resources from Food Effective Life can be linked in, and finally give some suggestions for further reading and sources of information. Firstly then, why is it important to know about the function of ingredients? Well, if you're guided by the National Curriculum 2014, you will know that the function of ingredients comes through from Key Stage 2. Where there is good teaching, primary schools focus on the sensory and tangible handling of ingredients, exploring many fruits, vegetables and mixtures of ingredients to understand their properties and qualities. Key Stage 3 then begins with a broad study of cooking, covering nutrition and health, using mainly savoury dishes for users and for a purpose, including ingredient knowledge, cooking skills and competencies, alongside seasonality and provenance. We need to get students to understand how ingredients work, explaining their function and characteristics. So it's about including and explaining that food science during the cooking and creating of dishes and meals. Key Stage 3 allows the essential commodities to be covered, introducing key terms and key examples of what ingredients are and how they function in recipes. All this precedes more in-depth work that will be needed at Year 10 in preparation for Key Stage 4. Knowledge of the function of ingredients prepares students for the GCSE course Food Preparation and Nutrition, and whichever board you use, it will clearly address food science. All the exam board specs require the understanding of the working characteristics, functional and chemical properties of ingredients to achieve a particular result in a recipe or product. This specifically covers carbohydrates, that's gelatinization, dextrinization and caramelization, fats and oils, shortening, aeration, plasticity and emulsification, and of course proteins, where denaturation, coagulation, foam formation and gluten formation are specified. So it's this area I want to focus on tonight. And bear in mind that students must also write a report on their understanding of scientific principles that underpin their choice of any A1 food investigations. So I'll touch on this too. To sum up this first section on the need for understanding function of ingredients, for me, it's all about good teaching and learning. That's the driver. It's what goes on in the classroom, what supports practical learning, and what makes cooking enticing. Hearing a teacher explain the function of an ingredient whilst using it to make a dish is heavenly. It tells us why cooking matters and what's going on as we combine ingredients. This slide shows my learning star. I've used it before and I think it helps hook on what the essential learning is around our very practical approach at Key Stage 3. And some teachers tell me they put these stars on pages between the set of recipes they plan to use during Key Stage 3. So it reminds the students of the wider learning that's being delivered. So for each practical, a few snippets of key learning can be attached to each of the 5 focus areas on the star, be it food preparation, food science, food safety, nutrition and health, and food choice and provenance. Another use for this slide is to be able to share what is being learned, to make it abundantly clear to anybody watching food and cooking lessons in action, and indeed also for the students taking part. I would stress that the understanding of science and all the strands is progressive, and it needs to be nurtured from the early years to year 11, starting with simple terms and observations and building that up. My firm belief is that practical work delivers the opportunity to motivate students to want to know all about the functions of ingredients. Let's just see again what I'm saying on this star chart. I'm aiming to illuminate where key learning could surround a practical food lesson. So for food preparation and nutrition, it would be the skills, appliance of heat or cold, combining and mixing, and a range of processes and techniques for cookery. Food science would introduce looking at the working properties and characteristics of ingredients alongside the effect of heat, acid, and combinations of ingredients. In other words, observing and experiencing food science in action, so it would be easier for students to understand. Food safety would cover perishable and non-perishable foods, shelf life, microbes, and contamination. And nutrition and good health would address nutrition education, all about the Eat Well guide, and modifying recipes and adapting meals. And finally, food choices and provenance would cover seasonality, regionality, and sustainability issues, plus allergies and food lifestyle choices. So I hope this helps you just see how food science in action fits into a busy curriculum, and that you can't simply extract the food science as a standalone. It has to be taught carefully within other aspects of cooking and food preparation. So let's get straight into tonight's topic. It's a wonderful topic. Thank you, Francis Meek, for thinking it up, because it covers such a range of commodities and allows us application within many recipes. So what exactly is denaturation? It's generally linked with protein foods, so it applies when we're using protein commodities such as egg, meat, cheese, fish, milk, tofu, or other proteins. It's generally, denaturation, is simply defined as the reaction of a protein due to either heat or acid. So it occurs when we cook food. Whatever the method of heat transfer, be it via conduction, convection, or radiation, some degree of denaturation will take place. We may decide to stir fry, bake, grill, shallow fry, stew, or use numerous other ways to get heat to affect and denature proteins, but essentially it is that heat that is the activator of changes in protein. They are irreversible and often affect solubility by making the proteins less soluble. Let's just start by reminding ourselves of the chemical makeup of proteins. Here's an image of protein molecular structures. You can see the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures. Those of you who've used my food science tutorials will recognise this slide. It shows the 4 structures of the protein molecule just mentioned. In the top left, we can see the basic chain of amino acids, the primary structure, which always remains in the same order. And then the secondary structure next to it, where we have pleating and folding of the amino acid chains. And bottom left, the tertiary 3-dimensional structures, and next to that, the more complex quaternary intertwined structures that we find in much of our protein-rich foods. So when proteins begin to denature, it's these formations of proteins that will unravel and open. During this, the bonds or bridges that hold the chains in folded formation will break. They're not very strong anyway, so heat or acid or even mechanical action will break them easily. You can see this in whisking egg whites or bashing meat steaks. Furthermore, as proteins unravel, so other bonds that were hidden become exposed and react by sticking together, thus affecting the solubility of the protein. Denatured proteins become less soluble, clumping and coagulating. Denaturation means the function of the protein will alter, and this is irreversible. Let's see this. Let's see this on an egg. Using eggs is perhaps the easiest way for us to demonstrate denaturation. And this type of denaturation is referred to as coagulation. Let me just go back because right, sorry, thank you. Let's look at this egg. Here the slide shows a simple visual to help understand denaturation. Firstly, in the raw egg, the proteins are packed in a nice tertiary 3D formation, and there's about 6 grams of protein in one 50-gram egg. And as heat is applied, so the egg proteins unravel and actually become easier to digest, allowing our stomach juices to break them down and utilize the proteins easily for growth and repair. The physical changes we notice as heating continues are that the egg white will set, and then so will the yolk, as the heat is conducted through the shell. We can, of course, control that process in egg boiling to allow a soft-centered, dippy egg yolk if we want. The lovely recipe on Food: A Fact of Life for spicy potato Scotch eggs, that's hard-boiled eggs wrapped in potato and rolled in couscous, would give you an opportunity to show this to your students. Let's continue with eggs and coagulation on this slide. Here's an introduction into investigations that you could use with your students. I know many of you have taken slow motion videos of an egg as it's denatured by heat in a frying pan. And showing this to your class could well be a focus in introducing the notion of investigating how eggs can be denatured by heat. Maybe with the year 7 or 8, you could explore different ways of coagulating eggs using different methods of heat transfer in readiness for a more in-depth study later at GCSE. With eggs in particular, it's the visual aspects that helps to explain the functionality of the protein's reaction to heat, where we can notice soluble to insoluble, liquid to solid, opaque to white, and raw to cooked. It's a classic GCSE exam question, isn't it? Explain the changes when an egg is fried. If we consider scrambled egg, let's see what we notice. Here, the denaturation via coagulation is easy to observe. Firstly, top left is a very lightly scrambled egg, still showing some traces of almost raw whisked egg. Then next to that is a lightly cooked scramble, moist and juicy. This texture is helped by the egg yolk's emulsification of the butter incorporated in the mix. And this is my particular favourite scramble. but it's not everyone, I know. Below this, we have a firm scramble, which looks drier and more solid. And next to it, the fourth sample, which is overcooked. It's overdone scramble, it's overcoagulated, and this can be seen where the proteins start to clump in larger clouds and the mixture is much drier and actually more rubbery in texture. On the right of this slide, there are two further plates, and I pop these in because sometimes teachers ask me about syneresis and scrambled egg protein denaturation. Obviously, it's a good time to discuss syneresis and to show what the seepage of fluid from a set coagulated mixture is. Just introducing that keyword is appropriate, even in Year 7, but only if they can see what you mean. I experimented with scrambling, and my top tip is to show syneresis is to use a scrambled egg mix with added milk, just a tablespoon to 2 eggs. This is because although without milk you do get syneresis with scrambled egg when it's overcooked, sometimes the heat of the pan drives off a little bit of watery fluid before you can really show it to the students. If you make it with added milk, you can still scramble successfully, as shown on the upper right photo. The proteins will denature and coagulate, as in a quiche filling too, to hold the hot liquid. But when overcooked, the proteins will denature and squeeze out the fluids they were holding. You can easily see the syneresis on this image, I hope. The worry, of course, with a recipe like quiche is that during cooking, it may produce the dreaded pastry soggy bottom. Yet, of course, we should celebrate that the denaturation protein can come to the rescue. If you use egg white brushed over the pastry during par baking, the proteins will set and solve the problem altogether. What is overcoagulation? Well, here I've included a diagrammatical representation of egg proteins in blue around the food sample. As we start cooking, see the blue protein shapes unfolding as they first become more digestible. And then gradually the proteins are affected by heat and the proteins denature more and become tougher and less digestible. Then those proteins lose functionality, being unable to hold a set or even their own fluids. And we can see those blue proteins denatured to an extent where they clump and toughen. And here syneresis may occur. This could be easily be taught and seen when making the tomato and basil tart recipe on Food of Fact of Life, or mini quiche, or simply on an egg experiment day, or an eggs for breakfast cooking event. Well, eggs could go on forever, but where else can we observe denaturation of protein? Probably some of the easiest to recognise situations where protein denaturation can be seen would be in meat cookery and fish preparation and cooking, and also in cheese cooking, especially gratin dishes, and of course in baked products using wheat flour where gluten is the hero. This meat and education poster clearly illustrates the many ways of cooking meat and offers lots of great recipes for use in the classroom. This meat and education poster is now available on the new Food of Fact of Life website. If we were working with meat, we can see denaturation whenever we apply heat and cook meat. Denatured proteins will be more tender as heat converts the physical structure of proteins. Tenderization makes meat proteins easier to digest, and we can choose the type of cooking that is most effective according to the cut of meat we're dealing with, such as slow, moist cooking for a tough cut and rapid methods for a more tender piece. As meat proteins denature, we are likely to see shrinkage during cooking whenever the heat transfer method we use, and whichever type of meat, be it pork, mince, lamb, gammon, or bacon. So meat loses about 30% of its weight during cooking as proteins denature. And the size of the piece of meat does matter, because you'll see the shrinkage of meat on cooking, particularly in a large joint, can be sometimes quite shocking, the amount of shrinkage you get. But with all meat, juices are released and can of course be used to flavour gravy or jus. And meat proteins change in colour from red to brown. And the surface colour changes too, due to the Maillard reaction. Pre-frying minced lamb for shepherd's pie or minced beef meatballs would offer a good practical experience to see this happening, as you're not likely to cook a large meat joint in school. On this page, we can see the difference between raw and cooked red meat as the proteins denature. A recipe like quick lamb kebabs on Food Effective Life would illustrate this nicely too, and fit into a 1-hour lesson. Of all the reversible changes that occur when cooking meat, the Maillard reaction is the most noticeable. It occurs when denatured proteins on the surface of the meat recombine with sugars present in meat juices. The combination creates the meaty flavour and sweet brownness associated with an outer slice of roast meat. Whilst this situation is the classic example of a Maillard reaction, the likelihood of seeing this in the classroom is slim, so simple recipes such as homemade burgers would still demonstrate surface browning and the Maillard reaction occurring in meat cookery. It's worth mentioning here that we also see the Maillard browning reaction when ingredients are mixed in baking, where both proteins and sugars are present together, such as in glazed bread rolls, loaves, and cakes. So the next 3 slides are going to cover marinades and meats, as this is mentioned in the GCSE specification, so it's very relevant. Marinades use acid ingredients such as vinegar, lime juice, and lemon juice that will denature meat proteins and make meat more tender. And other ingredients in the marinade, such as spices, herbs, and oils, will impart flavour and even colour. Acids, depending on their strength and time of immersion, will hydrate the muscle fibres and begin to convert collagen to gelatin. If you've tried the tandoori chicken on Food Effective Life, you'll see that the marinade here uses yogurt and lemon, so this recipe works within an hour because the marinade has yogurt containing lactic acid and with extra acidity from lemon juice and possibly some live bacteria, and all these will work together very quickly to tenderize the meat. Enzymes, of course, added to marinades through the use of fresh pineapple, where bromelain is active, or papain from papaya, or gingerpain from fresh root ginger, are also responsible for denaturing proteins and tenderizing. Let's just have a look at an enzyme in action. I showed this slide at the BNF Meat and Education Teachers Conference in Cardiff. It shows the formation of an enzyme, which is a protein in itself and acts as a catalyst to make things happen more quickly. The order of the amino acids makes the enzyme active, and they always remain in the same order, but they fold themselves up to create a unique shape that will penetrate a site. This is sometimes described as lock and key mechanism. You can see this protein chain has folded into an arrowhead. Proteases are the enzymes that work on proteins. Well, marinades combine a number of ingredients that all have functions in contributing to the tenderization of protein muscles and adding flavour to meat or fish. In lessons of 1 hour, it's perfect as small chunks of meat or fish can be used, and the cooking time's reduced because of the marinade. This slide shows us how an enzyme works. The GCSE specification requires an understanding of how marinades work, and using this slide, we can see an enlarged diagram of how the enzyme can break down meat protein in the chunks of meat. Generally, the portions of meat, or indeed fish, are smaller, so they can be immersed in the marinade. Leaving time for the enzyme to work is critical. Too long and the meat portion might go slimy, and not long enough and tenderization will not occur. The enzyme will find its site, as we can see on the diagram, and given time, it will break down the protein structure to tenderize the meat. And as I said, marinades contain several ingredients that function together, maybe herbs and spices, for example. So during the enzyme activity, other flavours and sometimes colours can penetrate the meat. And let's not forget that the acid may also be involved from ingredients like vinegar, lime juice, and lemon juice. Acids have free hydrogen ions that enable them to denature proteins and help tenderize them. So the combination of ingredients and ease of carrying out marinade type recipes in school makes it a perfect topic for a GCSE style question about function of ingredients. So let's move on to cooking with poultry. Jointing a chicken is a requirement of GCSE food preparation and nutrition, and therefore when practicing this, students may have plenty of portions to cook in different ways. And some of these will be high-skilled dishes that students will showcase in NEA2 practical skills. But some portions could offer interesting investigations and food science can be learned. Many of you will have students cooking with chicken, and in this case, denaturation is not seen by a dramatic change in coloration. Sometimes the flesh of the chicken actually becomes whiter during the cooking, and it's only the skin containing fat that will turn a golden colour if the heat is high enough. When cooking with chicken, looking and observing the changes before and after will give us clues to what's happening to the proteins as the chicken cooks. Chicken supplies a good amount of protein, about 50 grams of protein from one chicken breast. So the denaturation of the proteins, most importantly, makes the chicken more digestible. But also the protein denaturation will cause protein shrinkage. Even in small chicken pieces, you'll see some shrinkage. This larger image of cooked chicken shows that denaturation of protein makes the flesh firmer and drier. And this is why on cooking, some meats, particularly like poultry and classically turkey, are best left to stand to allow the proteins to reabsorb some of the juices that are squeezed out, so that they slice or carve more easily. Well, it does answer that rather awkward question that someone once asked. If you have denaturation, can you have renaturation? Well, yes, you can in some ways. The types of recipes that demonstrate this in school, though, could be Thai green curry or the Parmesan chicken nuggets on Food Effective Life, where small portions of chicken enable students to see the changes in proteins during cooking. Fish protein denaturation is one of the quickest and easiest. The amount of connective tissue is less, and the muscles generally far smaller than in meat, so once heat is applied, denaturation is quick. So fish muscle protein is easily denatured by heat and by acid, and marinades work well on fish chunks and portions. Students are required to know how to fillet a fish for GCSE and need to be able to use recipes with the fillets. Therefore, poached fish, skewered portions, baked fish, and recipes like fish and vegetable stack on Food Effective Life would give opportunity to see protein denaturation in fish. Alongside these recipes, you could also make the salmon fish fingers on Food Effective Life, because here you could introduce the notion of protecting the proteins by making a breadcrumb crispy layer around the fish proteins so that the flesh of the fish cooks gently inside and doesn't become tough. Now on to cheese. Heat applied to hard cheese will melt it. The almost equal proportion of fat, protein and water in hard cheese makes it easy to see the effect of heat. Firstly, at fairly low temperature, the fat melts. Secondly, the water will begin to evaporate and you might see steam. On the left photograph, you can see the melted cheese oozing its fat and water. Then thirdly, and finally, the proteins are exposed to the heat source and will begin to denature, squeezing out the remaining fat and toughening up whilst browning. The photo on the right shows that rich browning. You can see the tougher proteins exposed. All in all, the mouthfeel sensory attributes are attractive, crunchy and tasty, golden and glistening. No wonder au gratin toppings to cauliflower cheese, potato top pies and pizza are so popular. We might choose this to demonstrate when we're making snacks like croque monsieur or pizza toast or something similar. Whilst we're talking cheese, it's certainly worth remembering that milk proteins are curdled to make cheese. So that's a coagulation denaturation process using acidity or enzymes. Paneer cheese is a good example of cheese made using lemon juice to curdle the milk protein. And for most cheeses, rennet is added to milk after a starter bacteria. Rennet is a manufactured active enzyme named chymosin. Rennet speeds up the coagulation of casein and produces a strong curd with lower acidity, which is important for some types of cheeses. So it's casein, a protein in milk, that denatures by coagulation to produce cheese. Let's now change commodity and look at wheat flour, because we mentioned this a few slides ago. Wheat flour really comes to the fore with regards to protein denaturation in baked goods. Flour, as we know, contains plant proteins, glutenin and gliadin, that together form gluten in a moist dough. This single protein has amazing functionality in baked goods that is easy to show students. Heat denatures gluten to form rigid structures that hold the risen and cooked shapes of many products, such as banana crumble, top muffins, or all breads, pastries, biscuits, and scones. Here's an image of gluten when starch is washed away from a dough. Many of your students will have tried this as part of their NEA 1 food investigations. Gluten appears gradually from the washed dough as a grey coloured protein with very elastic properties. And here are the gluten balls waiting to be cooked. It's best to use very small portions, about the size of an acorn or best, because they will fully cook and dry in a shorter space of time in the oven. And here they are, cooked portions of gluten, firm and light and dried. Quite a magical thing for students to see. My top tip is, when your students make the gluten balls, keep them and store them for use in class whenever you're working with flour in a baked product. Observing a gluten ball must reinforce the message that protein is important for structure. But remember to be aware of allergies when handling gluten. Now we have a slide illustrating the structural properties of denatured gluten, caused by the heat from baking in most cases, hardening the protein and causing reduction of its viscoelastic properties. Depending on the mix of ingredients, gluten retains some springiness. Higher proportions of fat and sugar delay the denaturation of gluten during the cooking process. After making, staling of low-fat baked products such as scones or bread are seen as the proteins dry and gives us that characteristic hardening and drying. So on this photo we have choux pastry top left, white bread top right, creaming method cake bottom left, croissant in the middle, and puff pastry next to it. And these are all clear examples of the structural role of denatured gluten. Choux pastry is a requirement for GCSE students, and therefore including some science around these products as we teach them is essential. In choux pastry we have two proteins in action, the gluten protein and also eggs protein, both so stretchy while moist and hardened by baking to create the wonderful puffy structure. The biggest skill tip is all about drying the choux buns to perfection as you bake them, because we all know that if the steam isn't released, those lovely puffy pastries collapse very quickly in front of our eyes. But then there's a lot to learn from failure. So now to finish with, because time's going on, let's have a look at whisking egg white protein to enable aeration and foam formation, because these are classic examples of denatured egg whites. Both foam and aeration are possible due to egg protein's ability to form a structure. We know that the globular protein unravels and that denatured egg proteins reform crosslinks so that air is trapped and a foam is formed. The protein of albumin is denatured by agitation, by whisking, and further denatured by heat in the case of meringue or baked souffle. It's the texture changes that occur that we really enjoy when we eat products using foam. And this brings me to something you may know about better than me, but I thought it was worth mentioning tonight. This slide and the following one might be something you'd like to comment on. Aquafaba, or bean water, is the cooking liquid from chickpeas and other legumes. I've always just called it bean water, but now I've seen it referred to as Aquafaba in vegan cookbooks in particular. So how does it work? Well, because it's the juice surrounding the chickpeas in a tin, it's naturally full of proteins and saponin, which is a surface active agent, so it can be whipped up like egg white. It takes a little bit longer, but keep whisking and you'll see it will create a reasonably stable foam. So Aquafaba, or bean water, has some uses, doesn't it? Particularly as an egg replacer. It's useful for vegan meringues, mayonnaise, and so on. In order to help foaming, the juice can be boiled to reduce it, make it thicker so that it whisks better. But perhaps some of you have got suggestions for where you've used it and why it was useful. That brings me almost to the end of tonight's webinar. Thanks a lot for spending time with me. I'll finish with a few resources that might help you further to get up to speed with food science. On the left of the slide, I recommend that you use the new Food A Fact of Life website. It's always been a one-stop shop, and now it's even bigger and better and easier to navigate and search. On this website, you can sign up for a free newsletter, access all the webinars, and it gives you quick access to everything new and helps to keep you up to speed. Below that are a couple of websites I like to use: the sciencelearn.org and www.epicurious.com. And I like these ones in particular because they relate directly to practical aspects of food work. If you're teaching GCSE, then I urge you to use the GCSE exam board related textbooks and revision guides. All of them are a good source of exam related food science material, but look out for those that link science to practical topics and suggest ideas for investigations and experiments to carry out in the classroom. There's a big range of revision guides and they're all worth using. And so it's so important to use for exam preparation, but some are cheaper than others, so check out the prices before you buy. On the right of the slide is my website, thecookeryteacher.com. This is a completely free website to use and offers cook's know-how for each and every recipe on the site that explains simple science and function of ingredients. So it might be a good starting point for you or your students. Below that, you can see my food science tutorials are also available through a link on my website. These tutorials offer training for teachers wanting to feel more secure in their teaching of food science. So thanks for listening tonight to me. It's been great to have you here. Keep up the hard work in schools, and I wish you and your students every success in the future. And now I'll pass you back to Frances to finish the webinar session. And let's see if you have any questions.
Great, thanks Barbara. That was a really, really interesting webinar, so thank you very much. So some really fantastic information for the teachers to take away and use almost straight away. And you mentioned a number of recipes that are available on the Food A Fact of Life website, and we actually have probably about 170 recipes now which are available. So I would encourage teachers to have a look at those if you can. Just want to actually just show you some other resources that you might find that are of interest on the website. So we've got an area on there which is for 11 to 14 years at the moment. 14 to 16 years will be coming online shortly, hopefully by June, the end of June. But for the moment, most of our resources for secondary are in 11 to 14. And so we've got quite a lot of resources which will be great for functions of ingredients and food science, which are in the cooking area and particularly ingredients. So we've got presentations on protein, we've got food functions cards, we've got lots of different worksheets, we've got the viscosity charts. These have been put onto new templates, but they are sort of the same charts that you've used before. And then we've also got different activities, and this one particularly is to do with starches, which you might find of use. So thank you very much. Just before we go, there are some questions which I think would be great if you could answer, Barbara, but also it'd be really helpful if you could actually, as teachers, respond to the survey, which you'll be directed to at the end of the webinar. And it's really useful for us to see what you thought about the webinar, perhaps how we can improve things in the future, and anything else that you'd like to know about, and any future webinar topics that you think that we could do for you. We've also got some more webinars coming up in the future. So we've actually got one next week, which is food security, provenance and quality in the UK, and that's David Swales from AHDB. And one in May, which is overcoming challenges with engaging children on the autistic spectrum in food lessons, which I think would be really interesting. And then another one which perhaps would be of interest for your sort of personal development rather than perhaps professionally, is feeding infants and young children with a focus on behavioural aspects, and that's on the 22nd of May. But all of those webinars and the booking information can be found on the website in the training and the courses area. So a couple of questions, Barbara, if you're still there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I am.
Super. So Denise asked particularly about bean water, and there's a couple of questions about this. Do you have any other recipes using bean water?
I don't. I've just literally used ones that I've found in, particularly in vegan cookbooks, and some in magazines as well, vegan cooking magazines. That's where it's come to the fore, I think.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
And is bean water just for egg white alternatives or yolk as well?
Mainly white. Yeah, but obviously it works. It works especially in mayonnaise and in the meringues. So it's mainly the white that it's going to replicate.
Great, so thank you. And then there was another question a little bit earlier on, actually, when you were talking about fish protein and filleting fish. One of the teachers asked about alternatives to fish because one of her pupils is allergic to fish. And she was just saying, can a student use a different protein at this point? I'm not sure whether this is directly about filleting fish or whether it's about tenderizing fish. But is there anything else that she can use as an alternative?
Oh gosh, you put me on the spot here. I think oh gosh, if it's for skill base, she could just do something with meat instead of the fish if it's actually fish that she's allergic to. So use something that is a bit like fish in a sense, but it's meat. I don't know, even a chicken thigh or something. You could sort of fillet instead of doing the fish. It's difficult to actually put something in instead of fish, I think, in a way, but
okay, all right. Thank you.
Difficult to answer.
And another question has just popped up, actually. Are denaturation and coagulation interchangeable terms?
In a sense, they are, yes. It would be appropriate. Usually, coagulation is referred to in egg protein work, as far as students are concerned. But you could interchange those terms, yes.
Great. Thank you. So I think that's all the questions, actually, Barbara. So thank you very much. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us. What we're going to do in a moment is end the webinar, and you'll be taken directly to the evaluation. And then once you've completed that, you'll be taken through to your certificate. So thank you again. Have a very good evening. And hopefully we'll see some of you next week for the webinar with David Swales. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Barbara. Thanks, Francis. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.